Hello, and thanks for joining. I love being introduced by the last panel before break. That makes everybody a little bit anxious to get out, but I think this will be a really interesting discussion. Agriculture is something that we've looked at a lot at Eurasia Group. It's also a really big sector in both Canada and in the US. And increasingly, over the last few decades, it's become incredibly globally enmeshed. And having this global enmeshment creates both opportunities, but it also creates vulnerabilities. And in the last 3 years, between the pandemic and the Russian invasion of Ukraine and climate change, we've really seen much more clearly what these vulnerabilities look like. So on this panel, we're going to be talking about how we produce, how we package, how we process, how we transport agriculture around the globe, and how these different vulnerabilities have manifested and where we go from here. So I'm very happy to be joined by Dave MacLennan, Executive Chair of Cargill, by Ken Seitz, President and CEO of Nutrien, and by Earthryn Cousins, Founder and CEO of Food Systems for the Future and the former Executive Director of the UN World Food Program. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Sherry.
Thank you.
So we're going to start off talking about infrastructure, which was a big thread through the beginning part of this conversation here today. And part of the agricultural infrastructure is a little bit separate. However, it is similarly global and it is similarly affected by a lot of these different things that we've seen over the last few years. So I want to start with Dave. And Cargill is, included in is participant in the full agricultural chain. So you had a front seat to how all of these different crises were affecting the global food system. So I'm wondering if you could talk about how this shook out and where you see infrastructurally us going from here. What's needed?
Yeah, I think it's still shaking out. And if you think, and you alluded to it, the last 3 years have been probably the most intense and the most demanding than all my prior 40 years in this industry. It all came at once. And fortunately, it came at a point in my career where I felt prepared for it. Although you could argue that nothing really prepared you for what happened. I think what struck me the most is the resilience of the agricultural supply chain system. Nobody knew. We were all supply chains, we were making it up as we went along. But I think if you start with pandemic, the fact is we were still able to get food from where it was produced to where it was needed. Albeit there were spot shortages, there were certainly food shelves in certain places that didn't have what it needed, but it did get there and with some delays. Secondly, with Ukraine, we've taken a major hit, significant hit to supply chain from the breadbasket of Europe. Yet Ukrainian farmers are still in the fields, they're still getting crops out. They sat on ships from when the war started, the old crop in late February of last year, and fortunately the food corridor was renewed just a couple of weeks ago. So we are able to keep crops coming out of Ukraine, thankfully. And then finally, if you look at farming, it's an outdoor sport. Every single year is a roll of the dice relative to weather and climate volatility. And you see what's happening. We've had dry weather in South America. We've got a poor winter wheat crop in the United States. So there's always that variable. Fortunately, we've had a little bit of time to build stocks from a couple of years ago to when they were really tight. And when you have really tight supply and demand, obviously you get a supply disruption. Bad things happen relative to price or availability. But I think if you look at the resilience of the supply chain through the pandemic, through Ukraine, and through climate volatility, it's really been pretty remarkable. Now, that's not to say that we don't need to continue to invest, to your question, Sherry, about invest in supply chains and do more. And you heard one of the common themes today has been about infrastructure. But I think without sounding self-satisfied or complacent, we got through some really tough times, yet we still need to continue to invest.
And I would say that we got through some of those tough times because there was a focus on keeping some of those channels open. If everybody took their eye off the ball, it would have been different. So I think for companies like yours and for a lot of the people who were making this advocacy toward keeping some of the channels open, it was a really important piece.
Very much so.
Yeah. And Ken, I'd like to move over to you and specifically focusing on the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which really had a big impact on the fertilizer industry, specifically given that region's export market of fertilizer, plus the impact it had on European gas prices and LNG prices, because as most people probably know, gas is the critical input into nitrogen-based fertilizers. So given what we've seen in these last year from the Russian invasion and how that's affected your industry, how do you see the industry reorganizing itself, either technology-wise or otherwise, and how are we going to be moving forward?
Yeah, no, it is, it's a great question, Sherry. And I just start by saying that the backdrop for fertilizer and ag commodities, ag fundamentals in general, is strong. We're in an environment where the demand for crop nutrients is growing, and that's a growing population and a decreasing rate of arable land expansion. So the only way that we're going to continue to work toward food security and zero hunger on the planet is appropriate crop nutrition. And so backdrop is a business that's growing already. So then introduce this conflict in Eastern Europe where, whether it's Belarus or Russia, playing a major role in producing and supplying the essential crop nutrients that really just about any crop on the planet needs to grow. So whether it's, and I'll put a few stats here, whether it's potash, potassium, where the Russians are producing 20% of the world's globally traded potash, Belarusians also supplying and trading 20% of the world's globally traded potash. And last year, 2022, the Belarusian exports down over 50%, and Russian volumes down over 30%. So the numbers are really quite extraordinary. Sherry, you referenced the nitrogen plants in Europe that use Russian gas as feedstock, and at $40 per MMBTU feedstock in Europe, it just doesn't make any sense to run those plants. So we saw a third of those plants shut down in Europe in 2022 as well. Can talk about ammonia export restrictions out of Russia. We can talk about urea export restrictions out of China, where China's coming out of the worst drought that they've experienced since the 1960s and shoring up domestic supply, now domestic inventory in the name of domestic food security. And similar challenges in phosphate. So we can go commodity to commodity and say that this conflict in Eastern Europe has introduced some real challenges as it relates to crop nutrients. And I would say that for our part, for what we're doing here in North America and Nutrien's own production footprint, I mean, we're stepping in to try and answer the call on some of these challenges. And again, it gets back to the Canada-US discussion where we have our 6 mines in Saskatchewan producing potash. That is one of the largest endowments, geologic endowments of potash in the world. A couple hundred years worth of it, but we have lots of it, and we'll continue to mine it there. And we're expanding our production in Saskatchewan in order to meet this need. We've got our 9 nitrogen plants across North America that, by definition, with the lower feedstock, natural gas in North America, we're able to remain competitive, keep those plants running. We are investing to increase our production in nitrogen as well and meet some of this challenge. So, it's definitely a global challenge, Sherry. I think we're going to see this in terms of additional food security challenges. You've got the World Health Organization that's saying 8% of the world's population is going to be experiencing a food catastrophe by 2030. So there's real global challenges here. I would say in North America, we're uniquely positioned to step up, supply into some of these other bread baskets of the world that are going to be called upon to meet some of these food security challenges. And again, as Nutrien, we're increasing production to do that.
So it sounds like part of the way that you guys dealt with this was through a diversification of having a lot of different production capacity in a lot of different places. And Ertharin, I want to move over to you, and I know that you're focused right now. I mean, you've covered agriculture from every which way, and right now you're focused on food nutrition. And so given what both Dave and Ken had said, I'm wondering how the infrastructure vulnerabilities and also some of the good things that both of them have noted about the infrastructure right now and the resiliency, how this is affecting the global ability to get nutritious food where it needs to go.
Well, as we're sitting here today, there are 843 million people who are food insecure. There are 3.1 billion people who can't afford a diverse, nutritious diet. There are 150 million children who are chronically malnourished. There are 35 million people in the United States who are food insecure, and another 4.5 million people here in Canada who are food insecure. So yeah, they're right. We got food to around the globe. We had access to the right fertilizer. The challenge is when our food system is, while it's efficient, it's not agile. While it's effective and everything that has been said is absolutely correct, where during COVID, we were able to move food through the system, and we had some hiccups in the beginning, but the lack of agility in our food system resulted in the poorest and most vulnerable people in our own countries, as well as in developing countries, their access to affordable, nutritious food. And so that's the reality of it. And good work was done by every single company, but the challenge is our food system was broken and had challenges before COVID that were highlighted, illuminated, and underscored during COVID. That with the Russian invasion into Ukraine, those challenges began to reach a tipping point. Now, here's some more good news on top of what was said by my colleagues up here. Is last year, with this time when we were analyzing the impact of the Russian invasion into Ukraine, our fear was that we would have a global acute food crisis. And that instead of seeing 843 million people who were food insecure, we were afraid that number was going to tip into 1 billion. The world stepped up, including Canada and the United States. WFP raised for the first time $14 billion and was able to feed some 150 million people. The year before, they'd fed 89 million. So they were able to increase the number. So we were able to avoid that acute challenge. But as both of my colleagues have said, we have the challenge of a food system that has become more global. And as a result, food has become more unaffordable for many. And the challenge of the food system that we addressed in 2019 with the UN Food System Summit, where we said what we needed was a food system that met our environmental needs, our health and nutrition needs, as well as provided the financial return to all of the actors across the food system. We all agreed that that was what was necessary for us to move forward. And the problem that occurred is that we haven't agreed on the how. We haven't agreed on the financing for it. We haven't agreed on the policies that are necessary to catalyze the action that we move forward. We need to be better. We need to be as good at the medium and long-term work that is necessary to support our food systems transformation as we are on addressing the immediate emergency needs when our food system fails. And that's what we haven't been very good at yet.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm hearing a lot of similar themes from our former panel, right? About look, we know what the issue is. It's just, are we going to choose to walk down the path that it's pretty clear on. So I want to shift a little bit and talk about biofuels. This gets a little bit to what Earthring was talking about these competing needs for fuels. And Dave, I'd like to start with you. There's a lot of competition for crop right now, and in biofuels specifically, there's an increasing demand for them, at least a pending increased demand, as we start to see more pressure to decarbonize sectors like aviation and decarbonize shipping, for which biofuels have a potential solution. Mm-hmm. And so I'm wondering if you're seeing that this is something that is going to cause a shift on what is grown, and a shift on agriculture, and a shift on where it's moved to.
I think it's one of the most interesting issues in food and agriculture today. And those of you that have been involved in the industry or followed the industry will recall about 20 years ago when the ethanol boom was really taking off, and the same question was being raised. It was at a time when crop prices were very high. You had a huge China boom. They were absorbing and consuming a lot of different grains. And the question was, food or fuel? Is it going to go into your tank as ethanol, or is it going to go to feed animals and people? And I think today, to your point, Sherry, the question is food and fuel, and that farmers, through technology, through increased production, through innovation, will be able to do both. There are other alternatives to crops, to oil seeds. For example, food waste. You can take tallow, which is a byproduct of the meat industry, as well as use cooking oil from the food service industry. And we just built a facility in Belgium that we opened last summer, which takes the waste product and converts it into transportation fuels for trucking and shipping. So if you talk about a closed or a circular energy economy, it's not new crops being grown. And just to be clear, the transportation and the ag industry produces between 25 and 30% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions. Mm-hmm. So the intersection of ag and transportation is a vital place to provide a solution. Mm-hmm. But there's one, which is food waste, which doesn't require the production of new crops. We're not going to be able to do it just with food waste alone.
Right.
What it's also going to mean is, again, new innovations in how crops and where crops are grown. So, for example, Canada, we're increasing our investment in our canola production, our canola crushing facility in Western Canada, because, again, it provides fuel in addition to food. There's also an interesting statistic that there is a lot more, exponentially more capital from venture capital and private equity going into ag and food in the last 10 years than ever before. It's suddenly become an interesting, as I say suddenly, the last 3 years has become very interesting, and so certainly a lot of VC and private equity money went into healthcare and technology. Well, it's certainly going into ag and food today. But so I think through innovation, through more efficient ways of growing crops and producing crops, and remember that of row crops, 95% goes to feed livestock, 5% goes to feed humans. So when you think about the old dynamic of food or fuel, it's not that clear, or it's not that binary. It's a false choice. Mm-hmm. I think between resilience of the supply chains and farmers, which I talked about a minute ago, and I think also the use of regenerative agriculture, where the soil can become more productive through the use of no-till practices, through cover cropping. We can grow more without using more resources. I think there's solutions that ag and food can provide in conjunction with the transportation industry, so that it is not a false dynamic of food or fuel, that it's really going to be both. And I think we are already seeing that happen. You've read a lot about sustainable aviation fuel, biodiesel, and there's a lot of capital and a lot of crops shifting in that direction.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, indeed. I'm curious, Eartharin, what Dave is saying is that there is an ability to do both. And I'm curious to know from somebody who is very interested in feeding the world, is there any concern that you have about the rising demands from biofuels specifically?
Biofuels specifically.
Or anything.
You're right. Here's the reality. I spend a lot of time talking about these issues, as you could probably well imagine. And what my friends in the food security community often forget is our agriculture system is food, but as Dave was just saying, it's also fuel and feed, and the one we always forget about, it's fiber. And so we share the land with all of those very productive and very necessary uses of agriculture today. The question is, how can we do it better? How do we ensure that our agricultural production for food is enough to address that challenge that I talked about before with the access to a more diverse diet? How are our subsidies supporting the production of the various different row crops, the investments that are necessary to make all of our agricultural systems more productive, to increase the quality and quantity of our yields, whether those yields are for feed, fuel, food, or for fiber? How do we ensure that, as Dave talked about regeneration, that we're providing the financial support that is necessary to farmers to assist them in their methods of cultivation in order to protect the soils? Because we often talk about increased productivity, we don't often talk about soils. How do we integrate the new technologies, new seeds, new bioseeds, new digital tools to ensure that we can use less water, we use less inputs to support the more effective production of our lands? All of these tools need to be brought online, and brought online at scale to support more effective agricultural production and more agricultural production that is more sustainable. It is the answer to suggest we're not going to have biofuels, we're not going to have chemical inputs. We still need to feed people, folks. The FAO says we'll have 9.5 billion people by 2050. We need to increase production by 70%. That means that simple solutions may make for good conversation, but they don't make for the reality of what's necessary for us to ensure that we can feed the population.
Mm-hmm. That leads really well into another potential trade-off, but maybe not. Maybe there's a synergy conversation about sustainability. And Ken, I know that this is something that you and your company think a lot about. We kind of simultaneously have the need to feed the world that Earthrin has just talked about, and also we have a lot of call to be doing agriculture in a more sustainable way, particularly in regenerative agriculture. And fertilizers are right at the crux of both of those. And so I'm interested to hear how you see those two. Are they competing? Are they complementary? How do you balance those?
Yeah, in many ways, it's echoing what Dave and Earthrin have just talked about, and that is that, Nutrien, and consider this to be part of our DNA. We don't believe that the idea of increasing yields in sustainability are necessarily at odds with each other. And the reason we say that, or one of the reasons we say that, is we're the largest ag retailer in North America. So we have over 500,000 grower accounts between Canada and the US. We have 4,000 agronomists and crop consultants who have been working on that farm with those farmers for decades now to create trust, establish trust, and provide the best agronomic advice in the name of improving yields, pocketbooks for farmers, food security, but also good stewards of the land. And here we are today, and we're introducing now this discussion on the acre with the farmer, and we're talking about sustainability. And these different sustainable outcomes, whether it's biodiversity in the soil, whether it's climate, whether it's soil health, whether it's water outcomes, we're on that acre, we're having that discussion. And one of the best examples I can provide is what we call our carbon pilot. So we've signed up now over 750,000 acres in North America where, again, we're on the farm. We've digitally enabled our agronomists who have at their fingertips the best agronomic advice, best agronomic solutions, including our own proprietary products, working on that farm with the grower to improve yields, yes, but also baselining crop nutrients in the soil. We're soil sampling with the farmer, baselining carbon in the soil, and with those baselines, deploying precision agriculture, field mapping, only putting down the crop nutrients on the field that the field is calling for, but with that carbon baseline, then understanding how we can improve carbon outcomes, and whether it's zero-till or no-till technologies, whether it's our own slow-release nitrogen fertilizers that just give off the nitrogen into the plant root as opposed to volatilizing into the atmosphere. We're finding that we can generate a high-quality carbon credit on that acre for the farmer, and we know that the incentives need to be there for the farmer, whether it's a government incentive or whether it's the actual evolution of the value of carbon, that with the generation of that high-quality carbon credit, we have a new revenue stream for the farmer. And I really believe that as those financial incentives exist on the acre, farmers are going to stare more and more at that and say, okay, in the name of sustainability, but also when I do that, I have the best agronomic solution that improves yield. And again, through our carbon pilot, we're showing that. We think as an industry, many of us share this Scope 3 challenge on the acre, Dave and I do. Yeah. And that as an industry, what we're going to need to do is create partnerships across that industry to bring all of these technologies to bear. So we're not talking about food or fuel, we're not talking about food or fiber, we're not talking about sustainability versus all these things. We believe that if we get it right, we can achieve all of those things.
And Dave, I'm wondering, he had said that you're also thinking of this, and you guys have talked about it.
Yep.
How does Cargill factor in? I mean, when you think about sustainability, you're not only thinking about the growing part, you're thinking about the transport part, which I'm sure you're also talking about. But this whole Scope 3 idea across the chain, where do you where do you start, and where's your focus really?
Yeah, calling it the whole Scope 3 idea is exactly right. And that's one, Ken's company, our company. I mean, that's the big challenge because we are in many parts of the supply chain, obviously for our food and retail customers, but also all of the other suppliers in our supply chain, shipping companies, trucking companies, rail companies. How do you solve that? And I think Ken made the point well, which is the interconnectedness of the ag and food supply chain. There are so many parts to it. And so the whole Scope 3 thing, I don't know how to solve it yet. We're working on it, we all are, but I don't think any company has really figured that aspect of sustainability out. But I would come back to the point that agriculture, through technology, through innovative farming methods that both Ken and I and Earthern have talked about, can still continue to feed 9.5 billion people and reduce our greenhouse gas footprint in our Scope 1 and 2 businesses. Scope 3 is going to require a lot of partnerships, and it's extremely complex, obviously.
Yeah, I mean, I hear you that it hasn't been figured out. I have to say, from my perspective of working on climate change in the early 90s, having a CEO of a major company be able to know what Scope 3 is right off the bat is quite a graduation from people going, climate change, isn't that the hole in the ozone? It's like, it's quite a difference.
Yeah.
So Earthrin, I'd love to get your take also on the sustainability, how sustainability and food security and feeding the world react together. How do they dance together?
Dave said this, our food system from farm to consumer emits about 22 to 25% of the greenhouse gases. You can get into interesting conversation about the numbers, but the reality is that we know that it's not just carbon, it's also methane, which has a even more detrimental effect on our atmosphere. And so the transformation of the food system from the farm to waste, because food waste is another big emitter of methane, is quite critical to us achieving our climate goals. But we should also remember that the food system is also the system that is the most vulnerable to the climate crisis. The erratic rains that we're seeing, the windstorms, the droughts that are affecting farmers. We can't build technology fast enough to support the kind of seeds that are more drought tolerant or drought resistant, and the new tools that will provide farmers with the ability to produce in an atmosphere that was always risky, but now is reaching crisis level, particularly for the most vulnerable people and in the most vulnerable places on Earth. And so the numbers that we talk about of who's hungry and acutely hungry, with climate change will only continue to spiral if we don't begin to address these challenges.
Yeah, indeed. In fact, for the first time ever, water was one of our top risks in Eurasia Group's top risk, which it's not only affecting agriculture, but it is substantially affecting agriculture, water stress right now.
Well, 70% of all the clean water draws on an annual basis are from the food system.
Yeah.
And so we need to reduce those draws on a regular basis in order to address the challenges of the water crisis as well.
Right. So we're going to have to wrap up, and I wanted to go with a rapid fire question to each of you, which is we've got policymakers here from the US and from Canada, and if there was one thing that you would ask policymakers to focus on to improve agriculture along the whole supply chain, what will help feed the world, create all the different agricultural benefits that we've seen, the food, the fuel, the fiber that Earthrin had noted, what would that be? I'll go right down the line. I'll start off with you, Dave.
Trade. And so anybody in this room who is involved with getting USMCA done, thank you. We've talked about Canada, Mexico, North America. We could not feed the world without cooperation amongst our three countries. Let's continue to make it better. Let's never weaponize food, as it has been done in the recent past, but enhancing and supporting USMCA.
Ken?
Yeah, I would add to that infrastructure. I mean, these are bulk commodities that need to move around in vast volumes. They need to do that very quickly. Farmers need to get out and plant when the sun is shining, and so we need to move an incredible amount of volume through that channel, which requires reliable infrastructure. And that was talked about earlier today, but I just echo that those infrastructure investments are the lifeblood of agriculture on this continent, and in that the quality of that infrastructure is directly correlated in our ability to continue to grow food.
I would say subsidies. Much of the challenge that we have today is that we subsidize the problems that we've been describing here today. And changing those subsidies to catalyze farmers' behavior, to support regenerative agriculture, to support the diversity of crops that are necessary for us to grow, to ensure access to a more affordable nutritious diet is directly related to our subsidies. Private sector, you've heard private sector talk about doing their part. We need government to catalyze the activity that is necessary by providing the subsidies that are required to support that change in behavior.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Earther & Cousin, Ken Seitz, and Dave McLennan. I hope you'll join me in thanking the panelists.
Thank you. Nice job.
All right. And now you've got something to think about as you go out and have some coffee and other agricultural products outside.